To retake Crimea, Ukraine must at least secure the Kherson region first. This is because it provides a land connection from which it can launch an offensive and supply it from. But in order to do that, it would also first need to retake a better part of the Zaporozhye region. That would reduce Russia's ability to strike Ukrainian supply lines passing through Kherson region, and would provide a buffer region if Russia were to attempt an offensive to cut off or prevent a Ukrainian invasion of Crimea. Crucially, it would severely limit Russian-owned supplies to Crimea. Now, taking those two regions are huge operations in themselves, and they might take months or years once they begin. On to our video now. Let's take a look at geography of Crimea. In the south, there is a mountain range that spans the southeast of the peninsula between Sevastopol and Feodosia. The eastern region near Kerch consists of low hills that provide some defensibility to Russia's key crossings at Kerch Strait. The central part of Crimea, which constitutes about 3/4 of the peninsula, is made up of a level plain that slopes down gently from south to north. Said terrain is fairly open, and the whole area has a much lower population density, with its urban areas being smaller. The area would likely favor fast maneuvers and strikes from the air, if possible. Airstrikes, drones, and the use of armored and mechanized units would be at its peak, unless masses of trenches and obstacles, or drones and helicopters, bog down the armored formations, which is very likely to happen instead. The Sivash, or Rotten Sea, is a series of salty lagoons, wetlands and salt marshes that spans much of northern Crimea, separating much of Kherson region from the peninsula. This body of water is extremely shallow, with depths ranging from half a meter to 1 meter in many areas. It varies with evaporation in summer, which automatically means the early summer may be the best period for Ukraine to attack. Supplying an extended operation in Crimea would be difficult for both sides. It is extremely critical for Ukraine to secure the land north of the land bridge so it could secure its supply lines, as Zaporozhye and Kherson regions are the only way Ukraine can effectively supply an invading force. Ukrainian supply lines will pass through areas which have seen heavy fighting. As infrastructure would be severely damaged, supply convoys and reinforcements would initially be slow. Repairs would be needed, and this process could delay an invasion. Ukraine would use the E97 highway as a primary supply route. It runs through Armyansk and Ishun. In the long term, establishing supply depots at prime locations would help improve supply, but that may also create targets. Further east, another key supply route would be along the E105 highway through the Shonhar Peninsula. These will likely not be enough to supply the peninsula and will have to be supplemented with pontoon bridges and civilian ships. Those supply routes would need to be secured by an effective air umbrella. Given the still vast Russian number of aircraft, loitering munitions and land attack missiles, this in effect means Ukraine first needs to get several dozen more air defense systems of various kinds from the West and learn to utilize them. It is unlikely Russia could solely rely on the Kerch Bridge to supply Crimea, even if it was fully operational. And it's almost a given that it will be attacked again, as Ukraine has demonstrated its ability to strike it even before. By the time Ukraine moves on Crimea, it's likely to receive ample long-range assets to attack such targets and destroy them for good. Right now, even with the announced ground-launched small-diameter bombs, Kerch Bridge is out of range for Ukraine. So it would have to get different missiles. However, even without the bridge, Russia will still be able to move men and material into the peninsula. Russia operates 7 medium landing ships from the naval base in Sevastopol. Each can haul around 300 soldiers plus armored vehicles. Even more civilian ships and ferries would be involved. Russia used those to move men and material into Crimea during their 2014 invasion. Crossing points for ferries are a dozen or 2 kilometers from the opposite coast to Kerch. And Russia's mainland's major Black Sea port, Novorossiysk, is about 400 to 450 kilometers away from Sevastopol and 160 kilometers from Kerch. As the invasion of Crimea would be a long time coming, Russia would likely construct further ports around Kerch Strait and bring in additional boats and ferries. If it has a year of warning, it could possibly even create a land bridge and easily repairable pontoons over this part of the strait, which is very shallow and fairly narrow. Russia could further supplement supplies using transport planes operating between Krimsk and air bases in the Crimean Peninsula. The helicopters might be an even better choice there, as Ukraine will seek to sporadically attack all the airports and makeshift runways it gets the info on. Russian transport planes, while on Crimea, would slowly but surely get attrited over the months of such bombardments. In addition to these, Russia will have time to establish supply infrastructure, and satellite imagery used in Western media has shown Russia is already stockpiling a large amount of military equipment in northeastern Crimea. Russian logistics might be able to supply a fighting force numbering tens of thousands of troops in Crimea for a long time, possibly indefinitely, depending on Ukraine's firepower. Ukraine will have a tough time severing those supply lines to Crimea. Ukraine would use various attack drones, but these systems would likely not be able to consistently shell out enough damage. The Russian Air Force and air defense systems would be able to counter the Ukrainian Air Force's current strike aircraft. Guided rockets fired from HIMARS and similar launchers would be the weapon of choice. While Ukraine is managing to preserve their launchers and the number it has is fairly adequate, the key would be that the West keeps sending not thousands but tens of thousands of guided missiles. So far, Ukraine is likely to have received under 10,000 such rounds, and the US military has likely some 50,000 more in its stocks. GLSDB rockets that were recently announced for Ukraine would help there. The US might send a few thousand to Ukraine through 2024. By the time Ukraine is in position to threaten Crimea, the US could even send Ukraine long-ranged ATACMS missiles, which can be launched from Ukraine's HIMARS systems. These will likely not be enough alone to do any significant long-term damage to logistics because their numbers aren't that great, but during the key weeks of the attack, they might help paralyze certain Russian bases, logistics depots, and so on. The Pentagon has recently restarted procurement of ATACMS missiles, with 1,700 more to be made in the coming years. Right now, the US likely has some 3,000 in its inventory, out of the total of 3,800 that were ever produced. Missiles' added range might be crucial in covering the entire Crimea, as well as the Kerch Strait region. But what will likely also be needed are standoff cruise missiles for Ukraine, perhaps to be fired from Ukrainian aircraft. Such missiles could then come from another southern direction onto Russian defenses, greatly straining their air defenses. All those long-range standoff missiles would be absolutely crucial. They would have to be available in such numbers to keep pressure on Russian defenses, logistics, communication and command nodes in the initial days and weeks, while Ukraine tries to fight through the land bridge and break into the central Crimea. Russia has been setting up fortifications and defenses in Crimea. Within a year or two, Russia will have likely built a complex network of defensible positions by the time Ukraine gets in a position to advance on Crimea. Not unlike the network around Donetsk, built both by Ukraine and Russia from 2014 onwards. During most of the last year of the war, those positions near Donetsk have shown great resilience to attacks, with Russia only recently in 2023 managing to make small progress around Bakhmut. So any Ukrainian advance into Crimea is likely to also be slow. It's not plausible a great breakthrough will be achieved in mere weeks or even in the initial months. Russia had some 40,000 military personnel in Crimea prior to the invasion, of which some 25,000 entered into Ukraine in February 2022. But for a defense against an Ukrainian attack, it is very likely Russia would try to station even more. Area-wise, Crimea is the size of Albania, or Massachusetts. It had a population of roughly 2.5 million before the invasion. Since then, possibly hundreds of thousands have fled. If Ukraine manages to take Kherson region, it's likely many more people would flee. It's hard to estimate just how big of a military could Crimea support, but even upward of 100,000 doesn't seem unlikely. Crimea managed to get by without the crucial water supply canal from 2014 to 2022, even supporting 500,000 more relocated Russians. Indeed, the fight for Crimea may be one of the bloodiest battles yet, if it gets to that. Once again, it's also somewhat possible that Russia would give up once Kherson and Zaporozhye regions would be lost. Or it might just start using nukes. But disregarding those, the invasion of Crimea would likely involve a few times more troops than the current Ukraine's biggest offensive, which retook Kherson. But crucially, only a smaller subset of troops would get to fight initially in Crimea, as Ukraine tries to push past the land bridge and lagoons to northwest Crimea. The narrowest point en route to Crimea has some geographical peculiarities which would be crucial in the battle. The E97 highway runs across a land bridge to Crimea through Armyansk and Ishun at either end. It's a thin strip of land about 30 kilometers long. It features a few settlements and many bodies of water. At its thinnest points, it's only about 6 kilometers wide. Near Armyansk, it's under 10 kilometers wide. This is the most significant land crossing into Crimea and would likely be the focal point for a Ukrainian offensive. The next largest crossing into Crimea is between Novo-Oleksivka and Medvedivka. The distance there is 43 kilometers. The main E105 highway passes through a 1 kilometer wide stretch of land into the larger Chonar Peninsula, where it runs south. There is a bridge over the Chonar Strait, and there are smaller roads that enter the Chonar Peninsula over a roughly 2 kilometer long bridge to the west of the main crossing. There's also a 2 kilometer long bridge from Chonar into Crimea. All those bridges will inevitably get blown up. There is also a very thin strip of land called the Arabat Spit that connects Kherson Oblast with eastern Crimea. Its length is around 120 kilometers. There's a small minor road that crosses into Crimea across a bridge around 2.5 kilometers long south of Vasilivka. The major port of Odessa is about 190 kilometers across the Black Sea from the northwestern coast of Crimea. That's quite a distance to cross. Naval crossings across the Jaralhatska Gulf from smaller settlements like Skadovsk would still need to cross about 50 kilometers of the Black Sea. The land force could be supplemented by small amphibious landing forces. Those would try to widen the front, trying to dilute the Russian numbers on the land routes. The greater the length of the Crimean coastline is under threat of possible landing, the more troops Russia might need to keep away from the choke points. If Ukraine could succeed and keep troops well supplied by sea, this could help the Ukrainian offensive. But frankly, chances of that are low. Ukraine's biggest current amphibious landing experience is limited to a small commando operation to seize the Kinburn Spit with commandos in small boats. They do have one 50-year-old larger amphibious landing vessel. Ukraine might try to use tiny boats at night. They could land some commandos in such a fashion to cause disruption behind enemy lines, but the scope of this action would be rather limited. It's not feasible that Ukraine would even attempt a large amphibious landing. Firstly, the partaking craft would need to avoid the Russian Navy and Air Force. They would likely face opposition as they land, as Russia has been reported to be fortifying the northern Black Sea coast of Crimea. A larger landing would need more landing ships. Those can't be easily provided by the West, as they might get attacked en route, and likely sunk before they unload their troops. And finally, any such landing needs continued effort to supply the troops, with many more ships continuously bringing in supplies. While civilian ferries could be used, it's very likely Russian planes and helicopters would eventually put a stop to that. Simply speaking, without powerful ship-based air defenses to accompany the landing ships and an air force to prevent the Russians from striking from the skies, Ukraine is unlikely to go for large-scale long-distance landings. It would most likely be content to use boats in the Rotten Sea, ferrying light infantry. The Ukrainian Air Force would not likely be a great factor. It is significantly smaller than its Russian counterpart. Right now, there is no good estimate of how many planes Ukraine has left, but it may be just several dozen planes. Or if the Oryx photo archive is to be believed, it might be up to 50 or so. That number may drop further within a year or two, by the time Ukraine gets in a position to retake Crimea. Of course, the West may send jet fighters to Ukraine in the meantime. That's impossible to predict, but unlike all the other systems that Ukraine got, fighter jets are not as crucial. Knowing that, the West is reluctant to send jets. Even if some are sent within the next year or two, it will likely be a political statement quantity rather than a game-changer figure. And whatever is sent, due to support needed, may get neutralized by Russia eventually. SAMs and long-range rockets are much more cost-effective for Ukraine in their current situation. Sure, if the war got paused and Ukraine then got a year to establish an air force with 200 F-16s not worrying about Russian attacks, that would be a game-changer, but that's not realistic. Russia had around 1,000 tactical combat jets prior to the war. Again, if the Oryx photo archive is to be believed, they lost at least 66. So their totals even 1 year into the future are not going to be meaningfully different. Binkov made multiple videos on the state of the Russian Air Force and why it's performing so badly in Ukraine. So we won't repeat ourselves, but in a situation where Ukraine has to attack, and thus it can't rely as much on air defenses, and where Russia has plenty of airfields fairly close by that can generate a lot of sorties, even the badly performing Russian Air Force would likely be a threat. And Russia might be willing to trade 100 planes in strike missions if that manages to stop the Ukrainian offensive. NATO has so far delivered a sizable number of air defense systems to Ukraine. That being said, older Soviet systems are likely to run out of missiles by 2024 or so, and some war attrition is assured over the next year or two. So the West would have to send 2 or 3 times as many systems it pledged so far for Ukraine to have a fairly potent SAM umbrella. Here the medium-range and short-range systems, ones which are mobile, would be crucial for defense of Ukraine's forces as they advance. That's however not a strong suit of current NATO weaponry. Most of today's NATO systems are tailored for excelling at protection of non-moving forces. Certain countries like the UK or France might be especially crucial if they would be willing to part with a large part of their mobile SAMs. Polish-owned and Soviet-made OSA systems would also be an acceptable choice, despite their age. If Ukraine manages to advance far enough to the south and neutralize most Crimean airports, they will have a high chance of victory, as Krymsk airbase is rather far from Crimea. Alternative to that is Ukraine managing to upkeep such a barrage of missiles from HIMARS and similar launchers that they keep all those bases shut down most of the time. When one adds various frontline positions, supply depots and such, for all that to be engaged, the US would have to supply over half of its entire GMLRS missile inventory to Ukraine. The benefit of the missile approach, however, is that it would be done prior to the offensive. Indeed, without a similar artillery prep against Russian positions and facilities, Ukrainian attack may not even begin. Russia too has plenty of long-range artillery, but the key difference is that Russia seems to be lacking targeting info, compared to Ukraine, which gets its info from the West. Indeed, with the battle going on in Crimea, the Western recon aircraft that have been flying in the Black Sea and gathering images and other info on Russian forces will be even closer to the front line, thus even more useful. It's hard to say just what sort of artillery numbers may be present in 2024 or so, but Ukraine will need continued aid from the West. So far it has received some 620 artillery pieces, with another 340 pledged to come in 2023 and some as late as 2024. But artillery may also be the biggest threat to Ukraine. Due to the terrain and the choke points, one can see that Ukraine will have to deploy most of its artillery here, up to 20 miles from the end of the choke points. It means fewer Ukrainian artillery will be able to fire on Russian artillery pieces, which will be placed even farther behind. Some 60% of the artillery sent or pledged to Ukraine is a fairly short reach, up to 30 kilometers or less. While in most other situations such artillery would gradually relocate behind the advancing forces supporting them, in this choke point scenario with lagoons and land bridges, most of those short-range artillery pieces would have to stay behind, out of range, until Ukraine somehow manages to get a foothold on this part of the territory, past the land bridges and the lagoons, where they would have room to function properly, without presenting a bunched-up, juicy target for the enemy. Equally so, columns of any kind of vehicles going through choke points would likely be first met with many mines. Ukrainian forces would be forced to stop, demine the area, then fight through the cleared area before repeating the process, while under constant fire. Various guided anti-tank missiles would have an easier time attacking columns of vehicles forced through choke points. That the battle would be bloody is an understatement, really. What would Ukraine have on its side is morale, and by the point where Ukraine takes Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, Russian morale might be quite wavering, while Ukraine would be celebrating its victories and emboldening its troops for one last battle. Another point worth mentioning is the importance of amphibious vehicles. That's in the case the battles are fought in Ukraine's shallow lagoons, the area called the Rotten Sea. Even if some vehicles might go through half a meter or a meter of water, the soil underneath is meters of silt, which is close to mud. Soviets have prioritized amphibious capabilities for many vehicles. For example, Russia employs many BTRs and they have amphibious capabilities. While Ukraine had a lot of Soviet-style vehicles at the start of the war, many of those have been lost in the fighting. Vehicles coming in from the west are usually without as extensive amphibious capabilities, being designed for different kind of terrain and employment. While Ukrainian artillery and armor would be very important in the later stage of the battle, after Ukraine gets past the choke points, it's likely infantry would be key for actually doing that initial push through the choke points. We're talking likely several times more troops needed than Russia would have. The physical size of the battlefield is small, with just a 10 or so kilometer wide stretch of actual land and 50-ish or so more kilometers wide stretch of various marshes and shallow lagoons, so local troop number ratios will likely be closer to parity. Which is why it would be absolutely crucial that Ukraine somehow first wears down the Russian firepower platforms. If not destroys them, then at least suppresses them, artillery, tanks, etc. We're talking about massive firepower needed to come from the air, many more longer-range artillery pieces than Ukraine is getting, an order of magnitude more loitering munitions, and so on. If Ukraine would manage to get into the middle of Crimea, the rest of the task would get easier. Even if Russia somehow still has 100,000 troops left and 1,000 tanks, it would all be easier to deal with, as those units would be spread over a much wider front, like 150 kilometers of solid land at this point. That doesn't mean it would be easy, of course. Russia is still likely to have more armored units, so even when Ukraine manages to bring in hundreds of armored vehicles across the choke points, they would still be met with a few times higher number of Russian vehicles. Indeed, the middle of Crimea, with its flat land terrain, might see many tank clashes, but done while moving sporadically, as the terrain would likely be littered with fortifications and minefields. The lowly populated northern plains of Crimea would be especially conducive to such battles. If Ukraine does push further south, it might make sense to try and cut off the mountainous southern coast and Sevastopol from the Kerch region. But achieving that is easier said than done. It would mean Ukrainian forces pushing far away from their long-range fire support platforms outside Crimea. The flat lands would also make it very challenging to keep the supply train going under constant Russian air attacks. Finally, fighting in the mountains is very demanding and slow, and usually leads to a few times greater casualties for the attacker. But if Ukraine could secure most of central Crimea, hold it and resupply it, then they might be able to cut off the Russians near Feodosia, and thus in the long run completely push Russian forces out of Crimea, as the Russian Sevastopol forces eventually run out of supplies. Just for the Crimean battle, Ukraine might need hundreds of tanks and likely well over 1,000 IFVs and APCs, which means the currently pledged tank and IFV figures are unlikely to be enough, as those numbers and more would likely be lost even before Ukraine would reach the Crimean choke points. Furthermore, many Russians are living in Crimea, so the local populace is also likely to be against the Ukrainian force. However, the impact and scale of Russian partisans is hard to quantify. The battle for Crimea would be the crowning moment of the war for Ukraine. It would be a great symbolic and strategic victory and would be very bad politically for Putin. Russia is not likely to give it up without a fight, but that is possible if people and military revolt against Putin. Primarily, Ukraine would need key equipment from its allies if it wants to see success in huge quantities. Logistics in an operation in Crimea would be crucial, as it would still be hard to keep the forces supplied through those northern choke points. It is also worth noting that an operation in Crimea would draw Russian forces away from other fronts, as Russia would likely not trade Crimea for any other part of Ukraine it has currently. So a credible threat to Crimea may mean Ukraine would have an easier time retaking Donbas territories. Even without an actual invasion, if Ukraine manages to keep the Kerch Strait under constant attacks, Crimea may eventually fall once its supplies run out. That route might take further years, but it also might save countless lives. Of course, for any of this to be even plausible, Ukraine first needs to breach the Russian lines and drive towards the Sea of Azov, cutting off Russians in Kherson region.